Hey everybody. Uh, this is the fourth and final essay of the second batch of seminar readings that we're supposed to do for the graduate students are supposed to do for the Industrial Revolution course. Um, the essay is titled "The quote Survival of the Fittest" end quote, and the origins of social Darwinism. It's by Gregory Claeys. So here we go. In late September 1838, a young man aged 29, a former medical student and amateur naturalist, who had spent several years in the South Pacific studying plant and animal life, but who remained puzzled as to why, quote, favorable variants, end quote, of each species survived, while, quote, unfavorable variants, end quote, were destroyed, sat pursuing a book, as he later recalled, quote, for amusement, end quote. The book which provoked Charles Darwin was T.R. Malthus's Essay on Population, 1798, which he later claimed first suggested to him the idea that, quote, on the whole, the best fitted live, end quote. This idea Darwin will popularize through the notion of the, quote, struggle for existence, end quote, a phrase which he famously claimed to use as a, quote, metaphor, end quote, but which meant simply, quote, the doctrine of Malthus applied with manifold force to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms, end quote. That application resulted in the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859, an occasion hailed as, quote, the greatest event of Queen Victoria's reign, end quote, even, quote, by far the most important in the history of the modern West, end quote. It is well known, too, that Darwin's appreciation of Malthus was not unique even among naturalists. The year before The Origin of Species appeared, another young man, Alfred Russel Wallace, aged 25, encountered the very same book. Quote, there suddenly, end quote, he later recalled, flashed upon him, quote, the idea of the survival of the fittest, end quote. Alfred Russel Wallace. We know Wallace today, thus, as the co-discoverer of theory of natural selection, who presented a paper jointly with Darwin at the Linnean Society on the momentous evening of the 1st of July, 1858, to mark their brilliant achievement. This curious coincidence has often been noted, but its ramifications require further assessment. This article examines some crucial 19th century sources of the idea of the, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, which came to underpin many of the social and political doctrines later associated with the theory of natural selection, and also what were regarded as some of the limits of this idea. It contends that there was in fact far more than mere coincidence in the obviously provocative role played by Malthus's essay for both Darwin and Wallace. It argues, therefore, against the presumption of tacit causality, logically implicit in the concept of, quote, social Darwinism, end quote, that much of the social and political theory which nominally invoked Darwin was fundamentally derived from, as opposed to being reinforced by, the principles of natural selection. It challenges the view that the logic of discovery in the natural sciences, in other words, induced parallel or derivative concepts in the social sciences, and that the, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, emerged first as a natural and then mutated into a social concept. Instead, it suggests that what was specific about much of social Darwinism resulted from several shifts in thought in mid-Victorian Britain to which Darwin himself also responded, and which therefore also vitally influenced his own development. No doubt, of course, this assertion of causation contains some truth. Darwin was extraordinarily widely read and extraordinarily influential. We are all aware of the great theological debates associated with his name in late Victorian Britain, of the counterattack against Darwin begun by Bishop Wilberforce in June 1860, and of the tenacious war of attrition conducted by, quote, Darwin's bulldog, end quote, T.H. Huxley, who coined the term, quote, agnostic, end quote, in 1869 to define the lack of scientific evidence for the existence of God. Much has been written of the moral panic and growing loss of religious faith, paralleling the course of Darwin's own, quote, reluctant agnosticism, end quote, which followed the conclusion that human beings had been leveled to the status of animals and deprived of special providential creation, as well as any divine purpose in the perpetuation of their species. In history, a tremendous impetus was given to the search for certain laws of social development. In social and political thought, Darwin reinforced the individualism of Spencer and Maine, but also clearly paved the way for more collectivist notions of state activity. In his moral philosophy, Darwin spawned a great debate about the role altruism does and should play in social development. Nor are many ignorant of the process by which, rushing into the moral vacuum seemingly created by evolutionism, a variety of secular ethical standpoints notionally derived from Darwin were created, such as Friedrich Nietzsche's will to power, Wille zur Macht, and the doctrine of the Superman, with the extension of the doctrine that, quote, might is right, end quote, to international conflict and rendering of Darwinism, quote, in terms of efficiency resting on force, end quote, warfare between nations at a time of critical intra-European economic, military, and imperial competition was increasingly praised as a salutary means of testing the criteria of survival. Selfishness, personal and national, seemed to be the prescribed law of social evolution. To assist the weak by any form of mutual aid was to act as the, quote, persistent enemy of progress, end quote. The Darwinian worldview, quote, red in tooth and claw, end quote, thus seemingly legitimated both social and international warfare. By 1900, indeed, social Darwinist ideas of, quote, struggle, quote, fitness, and, quote, survival, of the eternal Hobbesian war of all against all, individual, national, and species-centered, had become virtually omnipresent and definitive of one of the most important modern trends in European and American thought. Yet for the intellectual historian concerned with how ideas themselves evolve, the crucial question remains how much these developments ought to be associated with Darwin himself and how far they expressed a pre-existing train of thinking. We ought to be suspicious at the outset at claims that this, quote, influence, end quote, that most maligned of word in the history of ideas either ran all in one direction or concentrated itself so intensively upon Charles Darwin. Instead, Darwin was a relative latecomer to a debate Darwin was a relative latecomer to a debate which crossed social theory as well as biology, geology, and a number of other disciplines. Two factors at least suggest this. We know, of course, that Darwin was not the inventor of the term, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote. That honor belongs to Herbert Spencer, today best known as a founder of sociology, but the greatest polymath, and to Darwin, as well as Wallace, the greatest philosopher of his day. Spencer coined the term in 1852 in an article on population theory, while suggesting that intraspecific struggle, largely provoked by the pressure of population growth, resulted in, quote, progress, end quote, with the survival of plant and animal species being dependent on their fertility. And we have the curious coincidence I have just noted of the dual inspiration of Malthus upon both Darwin and Wallace, as well as Spencer, to consider. What I wish to suggest here is that the concept of, quote, social Darwinism, end quote, insofar as it focuses centrally on the idea of the, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, is to a significant degree a misnomer. Much of what we associate with the concept had been in formation for over half a century by the time of The Origin of Species appeared in 1859. We may promote other misconceptions by calling Darwinism, quote, scientific Malthusianism, end quote, or alternatively by redefining, quote, social Darwinism, end quote, as, quote, social Spencerism, end quote. But we can at least conclude, I think, that Darwin's discoveries occasioned no revolution in social theory, but instead involved remapping with the assistance of a theory of the biological inheritance of character traits, a pre-existing structure of ideas based largely, though not exclusively, upon a Malthusian and economic metaphor of the, quote, struggle for existence, end quote. This in turn will permit us to focus much more precisely on what Darwin's own contribution to this process was, how exactly it was formulated, and when, quote, social Darwinism, end quote, as such emerged as an intellectual project. We need first to establish, however, that the origins of the Darwinian, quote, metaphor, end quote, what the origins of the Darwinian, quote, metaphor, end quote, were. Okay, so I'm continuing with the Gregory Claeys. I'm reading outside on campus, and I'm shirtless. People probably look at me thinking, damn, he's hot. In more ways than one. Okay. The most recent study, Social Darwinism, the most recent study of the subject, Mike Hawkins' Social Darwinism and European and American Thought, 1860 to 1945, isolates four main assumptions as composing the social Darwinist worldview. First, biological laws govern the whole of organic nature, including humans. Second, the pressure of population growth on resources generates a struggle for existence among organisms. Third, physical and mental traits confer an advantage on their possessors in this struggle, or in sexual competition, which advantages can, through inheritance, spread through the population. And last, the cumulative effects of selection and inheritance over time account for the emergence of new species and elimination of others. These doctrines clearly cover a multitude of intellectual positions linked by their use of quasi-biological or organicist explanations of social evolution, class divisions and poverty, and racial and national stages of development. It is a mistake, therefore, to presume that there was a single, quote, politics, end quote, of social Darwinism, or that all forms of social Darwinism were illiberal. Evolutionist perspectives bolstered liberal arguments in a number of notable instances. In Walter Bagehot's Physics and Politics, 1872, for example, liberal democracy was touted as most likely to ensure progress towards higher forms of social development. Primarily because political freedom ensured the wider circulation of competing ideals and people. Similarly, the economist W.R. Gregg fashioned natural selection into a radical anti-aristocratic ideal by emphasizing the necessity of rewarding achievement rather than social status. By the mid-1880s, when the, quote, social problem, end quote, was once again squarely on the agenda of public debate and was widely understood in social Darwinist terms, the new liberal David Ritchie's Darwinism and Politics, published in 1889, too, gave social Darwinism a collectivist slant through the argument that the state, acting as a benevolent institution, could assist social evolution by freeing individuals from a perpetual struggle for the means of existence. This was supported by Benjamin Kidd's Social Evolution, published in 1894, and much of Huxley's writing. Darwinism was wedded to anarchism by Kropotkin and socialism by A.R. Wallace himself, among others. What unites the various forms of social Darwinism, then, is not a specific political instance, but the application of the idea of evolution to a higher social type. On the basis of social competition between, quote, fit and, quote, unfit groups and individuals whose, quote, fitness or, quote, value to society can be defined in a number of ways. Let us now consider how far such ideas were prefigured in the first half of the 19th century by turning to the most common model of social competition in the period, that provided by Adam Smith's notion of natural liberty, as crucially amended by Malthus's essay on population. Malthus. In its rough outlines, the main claims of Malthus's, quote, discovery, end quote, are well known. Writing at the end of nearly a decade of fierce political debate, in which the ambitious radicalism of Painite democratic theory jostled between the more speculative utopianism of William Godwin, Malthus asserted that population growth, escalated geometrically, tended inevitably to outstrip food supply, increasing only arithmetically. The elemental natural fact for Malthus fatally undermined all ideas of dramatic and sudden social improvement. Godwin and Condorcet were the chief targets of the first edition of the essay. Later, Robert Owen's schemes for rehousing the poor in rural socialist communities would take their place. Get some water. It's warm. All right. In Malthus, original sin. Get out of here. In Malthus, original sin in the form of sexual desire thus returns with a vengeance, pushing population growth relentlessly onward unless positive, quote, positive checks, end quote, like war and misery curtail it. The second edition of the essay gave greater scope to quote, preventative checks, end quote, like moral restraint. Society is not fashioned by rational creative design, but always operates within constraints imposed by the lower animal passions. The poor in particular breed too much. This is the principal cause of their poverty. For Malthus, society cannot foot the bill. Centrally, therefore, its woes cannot be ascribed to flaws in social and political design, which for Malthus were, quote, mere fetters on the surface in comparison with those deeper-seated causes of impurity that corrupt the springs and render turbid the whole stream of human life, end quote. The central message of the essay, as the 19th century often read the work, was thus hostile to the rights-based discourse of radical social and political reformers, but equally to similar rights-based contemporary assumptions about the entitlement of the poor to charity and distress. With a year of famine, 1800 to 1801, intervening between the first and second editions of the essay, Malthus strengthened his denial of the poor's right to charity and included in the 1803 edition a remarkable and soon famous passage well worth recalling, for it marks the birth of our paradigm or, quote, metaphor, end quote. Quote, a man who is born into a world already possessed, if he cannot get subsistence from his parents, on whom he has a just demand, and if the society do not want his labor, has no claim of right to the smallest portion of food, and in fact has no business to be where he is. At nature's mighty feast there is no vacant cover for him. She tells him to be gone, and will quickly execute her own orders, if she does not work upon the compassion of some of her guests. If these guests get up and make room for him, other intruders immediately appear demanding the same favor. The report of a provision for all that comes fills the hall with numerous claimants. The order and harmony of the feast is disturbed. The plant that before reigned is changed into scarcity. The plenty that before reigned turns into scarcity. And the happiness of the guest is destroyed by the spectacle of misery and dependence in every part of the hall, end quote. Malthus. It is perhaps worth stressing that Malthus did not intend his vision to be in itself cruel, nor to draw agnostic consequences therefrom. Indeed, he thought the population principle was a divinely inspired device which aimed, in the face of human nature that was, quote, inner, sluggish, and averse from labor, to furnish the most unremitted excitements, to urge man to further the gracious designs of providence by full cultivation of the earth, end quote. Nonetheless, many readers may be forgiven for having missed the finer ethical and political implications of this position. For Malthus, of course, did propose gradually abolishing the poor laws as a means of ensuring that the natural and necessary course of nature was not stemmed by human error. Benevolent assistance did not aid the poor, but weakened their prospects for survival by undermining their desire for independence. Augmenting population and indulging idleness without increasing the food supply. The new Poor Law of 1834, with its attempt to compel a mandatory workhouse regime on the principle of, quote, less eligibility, end quote, proposed to separate husband and wife and was centrally concerned to distinguish between the, quote, deserving and, quote, undeserving, end quote, poor. Quote, according to their several degrees of prudence or, quote, or industry, end quote. Its chief aim to ensure that the poor paid for their own relief, some even proposed that female paupers be compelled to sell their hair, is rightly taken to be the fruit of Malthus's seed, nurtured in a Benthamite hothouse. In 1834, poverty was believed to be chiefly a function of character. Assisting the poor prevented them from supporting themselves. But we are but a step, though a substantial step, from the evolutionary view that aiding the unfit may undermine the organic improvement of the race. Malthus's melancholy pessimism respecting those, quote, unhappy persons who, in the great lottery of life, have drawn a blank, end quote, was tempered by the proposal that some charity towards the poor was necessary and that a measure of state intervention, the Corn Laws notably, justified. The criterion of such support, however, is crucial to my argument. For Malthus, the poor ought not to be assisted principally on the basis of need or the honor which humanitarian benevolence bestowed upon the giver of charity. Instead, Malthus's model is predicated on the necessity of accumulating a social fund of surplus produce. Or capital, out of which all were to be maintained. It was, therefore, both, quote, natural and just, end quote, that those who owned a share of the produce assisted others who were both able and willing to, quote, exert their strength in procuring a further surplus produce, end quote. Malthus's revolution, then, was to popularize a redefinition of charity according to a doctrine of economic consequences. With idleness demonized, as it had been previously at occasions of national anxiety, the capacity to produce now defined the right of assistance. Like everyone else, the poor would have to pay their own way. Malthusianism and political economy. Malthus viewed society in terms of an organic metaphor in which similar laws governed both animal and human worlds. He strongly distinguished between people who benefited society as defined in terms of productivity and those who did not, and he defined rights as derived solely from productivity. Competition as natural selection dictated the survival of the, quote, fittest, end quote, and the starvation of the less successful unless other factors intervened. We do not, of course, have a theory of inherited characteristics in which this, quote, fitness, end quote, is transmitted, but we do very nearly have the symbolic imagery, so suitable to an age that prized usefulness above all else, in which such a concept functioned not as a science, but as social theory. The creation of the imagery of the, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, was also indebted to other controversies. Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had popularized a notion of organic struggle in several works. Robert Chambers' extremely popular Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation published in 1844, had adverted to the poorer life chances of those who were, quote, inferiorly endowed, end quote. More influential still were debates surrounding enormously popular phrenology works like George Combs' The Constitution of Man, published in 1828, or that induced by Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, published in 1833, which, as Darwin noted in The Origin, dwelt frequently on the notion of a, quote, universal struggle for existence. Initial forays into the evolution of man had been made by Lord Monboddo. Among others, the sociology of Auguste Comte had done much to introduce evolutionary ideas into social science. Notions of the functional utility of war in weeding out the, quote, fit from the, quote, unfit had also been developed by Ferguson, Hegel, and others. Between Malthus and Darwin, one further development assisted in publicizing this imagery of competitive struggle and just desert more than any other, which has often been loosely linked to the origins of social Darwinism but rarely detailed. During the half-century following the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, classical political economy emerged as an explanatory mechanism of immense importance, eventually becoming the master social science of modernity and its interpreters the high priest of modern civilization. There were, of course, many different types of political economy, and not a small amount of resistance, largely Tory or socialist, to the dissemination of the free trade ideals of the Scottish school. But after about 1820, an orthodoxy was clearly emerging, greatly stimulated by the publication of David Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in 1817, in which Malthusian ideas of the tendency of the working class wages to remain at the subsistence level did much to make political economy the, quote, dismal science, end quote. Political economy thus provided a technical vocabulary and a model for showing how Malthusian ideas of struggle could be understood in terms of social class and economic competition. It is no exaggeration to assert, moreover, that the triumphal conquest of the new science effected a near seismic shift in perceptions about nations and international order, as well as classes and individuals within nations. Homo economicus could not and would never completely replace Homo politicus, but the modern conception of international economic competition based on productivity, performance, and capital accumulation displaced to a substantial degree the notion that the primary contribution of citizens as such to national well-being lay in their virtue, patriotism, and valor on the battlefield. If, quote, fit nations were those capable of maintaining a competitive edge over their neighbors, quote, fit, end quote, individuals in political economy, there were those who were productive where others were not. Distinguishing between, quote, productive, end quote, and, quote, unproductive labor had been vital to the argument of Smith's Wealth of Nations, which defined that labor alone as productive, which added value to durable commodities which could be exchanged for a quantity of labor equal to that which originally produced it, end quote. By contrast, quote, unproductive labor produced nothing which afterwards procured an equal quantity of labor. The moral implications of Smith's distinction were to remain central to the self-conception of 19th century Britons. For in this version of the labor theory of value, we have an ideal of utility, worth, or, quote, fitness, end quote, which was increasingly read as favoring manufacturers and laborers over landlords, to take the three great economic classes as Ricardo distinguished them. The most important mid-19th century economist, John Stuart Mill, would continue to adhere to this conception. We note, too, that Spencer contended that every citizen should, quote, perform such functions or share of function as is of value equivalent to least to what he consumes, end quote, and countenancing, quote, the poverty of the incapable, the distress that comes upon the imprudent, and the starvation of the idle, end quote. Accepted such a doctrine. Early socialists were also devoted to the proposition of reducing unproductive labor and maximizing productive labor. Political economists did not, of course, usually presume that less competitive sectors of the economy would literally, quote, die out, end quote, as a result of their collision with more competitive, but always adapt their skills to be benefit of the entire economy. There is little doubt, however, of the linkage of these assumptions to other accounts of progress in this period, or of the contribution which Darwinism in turn would make to this language after 1859. This was not, therefore, a narrow technical debate within political economy, but a conflict over various ideals of the social good, which in fact went to the heart of 19th century Britain's self-image. The logic of, quote, competition, end quote, both national and international, had been widely popularized by mid-century, notably in the debates over machinery and trades unionism during the 1820s, and again over Corn Law repeal in the 1840s. Ideas of competition were used by both middle and working class writers, particularly in the wake of the 1832 Reform Act, to proclaim the validity of a meritocratic political and economic system, the, quote, carrière ouverte au talent, quote, end quote, against a system based on, quote, old corruption, end quote, and family connection. By mid-century, these notions had been sufficiently widely accepted to bring about what Harold Perkin has termed, though not without challenge, the, quote, triumph of the entrepreneurial ideal, end quote, in which a concept of social status based upon capital ownership displaced one based on inherited rank or fortune, with competition being the unbiased arbiter of effort. Race, competition, and social Darwinism. I have contended so far that Darwin's metaphorical application of the, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, to society was in fact virtually a commonplace by 1859. Malthusianism and political economy in particular created a worldview in which the first three of these components were prominent. Mankind being governed by natural laws shared by animals in a world in which scarce resources were acquired through greater mental and physical effort, or in the case of thrift, abstinence from present pleasures, and in which the most, quote, fit, end quote, quote, desirable, end quote, or, quote, valuable, end quote, members of society, the most, quote, useful, end quote, or productive, survived or ought to survive. Transmuted into the ubiquitous mid-Victorian notions of, quote, respectability and, quote, character, in which a division between idle and industrious, provident and profligate, was crucial. These ideas became central to the self-identity of the age. Quote, character, end quote, in particular, was often the term applied normatively to describe, in Wallace's phrase, quote, the aggregate of mental faculties and emotions which constitute personal or national individuality, end quote. Quote, character, end quote, was to prevent evolutionary degeneration and in a constant Gibbonian echo halt the barbarians at the gates of the new Rome. Yet, quote, social Darwinism is not entirely a misnomer. What then was novel about and what remains distinctly, quote, Darwinian about social Darwinism? Four theses suggest themselves. First, what was new in the 1850s, at least at the popular level, was the notion that inherited characteristics, rather than individual and collective moral effort and education, cumulatively played a distinctive role in the character of a people. But this view can, of course, also be associated with Herbert Spencer's idea of the improvement of type. Malthus had formulated the struggle for existence. Darwin, Wallace, and Spencer added that this struggle improved species as well as degenerated new species via the hereditary transmission of traits. Excuse me. Second, the application of ideas of inherited characteristics to society not only came from sources other than Darwin, but Darwin himself. In the years between The Origin of Species, published in 1859, and The Descent of Man, published in 1871, the Descent of Man, published in 1871, reformulated his ideas considerably. The Origin was not, of course, connected with human, much less social evolution, nor were its social implications necessarily optimistic. Indeed, as soon as Darwin's ideas were applied to society, it was widely recognized that if the criterion of, quote, fitness, end quote, was fecundity, it was the poorer and most degraded classes, with the largest families, who seemed most likely to dictate the future course of human evolution. By the mid-1860s, Darwin was anxious to resist this conclusion. Here he turned for assistance to Wallace's 1864 research on the tendency of natural selection to promote human intelligence. He also praised Galton's pioneering 1865 article on, quote, hereditary talent and character, end quote, which emphasized that racial characteristics were transmitted, quote, as truly as their physical forms, end quote, and lamented that, quote, we are living in a sort of intellectual anarchy for the want of masterminds, end quote. He greatly admired W.R. Gregg's 1868 article on the failure of, quote, natural selection, end quote, in the case of man, which argued robustly for the triumph of civilized over savage races as the result of, quote, natural selection, end quote. And he must have recalled, with most of these writers, that Spencer had insisted that human development depended not on fertility, but increasing mechanical skill, intelligence, and morality. As a consequence, Darwin himself accepted the crucial shift in the definition of, quote, fitness, end quote, in the human species from fecundity to intelligence. In the mid-1860s, Darwin himself became, in effect, a social Darwinist, and became increasingly the hope that the optimal outcome of human natural selection would be the triumph of the, quote, intellectual and moral, end quote, races over the, quote, lower and more degraded ones, end quote. It must be stressed that this was not the inevitable outcome of the logic of the origin of species, nor the only path Darwin might have trod, but the specific result of his reaction to a variety of criticisms and fellow philosophers. In this sense, too, then, quote, social Darwinism, end quote, was not as such, quote, Darwinian, end quote, but the result of Darwin's acceptance of other interpretations of evolutionary theory, some of which were incorporated into The Descent of Man. Third, therefore, we see that a complex language of race played a pivotal role in this transition. In The Origin, Darwin had used the term race very loosely to denote species in general. Although the language of race in The Descent is overlaid almost exactly on an earlier familiar language of savagery and civility, which was itself central to the existing justification of imperial expansion, Darwin here presumes that the, quote, civilized races encroach on and replace, end quote, the savage, with the, quote, lower races, end quote, being displaced through the accumulation of capital and the growth of the arts. Here, too, the language of class is not far removed from that of race. Darwin warns of the, quote, degeneration of a domestic race, end quote, because the human species allowed its worst members, quote, the very poor and reckless, end quote, to breed so wantonly and injuriously. Quote, whilst the careful and frugal who are generally otherwise virtuous marry later in life, end quote, with a consequent, quote, retrograde, end quote, effect on human progress. This sense of the poor as a, quote, race, end quote, genus type or species apart would continue in much of the discourse on poverty of the 1880s, as it had done loosely in the 1860s in the writings of Mayhew and others. In effect, the barbarians were already inside the gates and already manifested a healthy appetite for social and political power. Fourth, what was most distinctive about much, though not all, social Darwinism was its concern not with, quote, race, end quote, as such in the loose sense of a term of general classification, but with a new definition of race directly attached to skin color, in which ideas of racial hierarchy and supremacy were wedded to earlier notions of, quote, fitness. Race was now assumed to be a determinate, independent factor in human evolutions. In particular, the racial polarity between so-called Anglo-Saxons, Britons, Greeks, and Romans, supposedly derived from a common Aryan ancestry and non-quote white, end quote, races, relied primarily upon a fixed ontological rather than an evolutionary, climatic, or cultural perspective on society. Earlier distinctions between Europeans and non-European peoples had paid greater heed to the effects of climate on behavior. We think of Montesquieu, or the relative levels of savagery or civilization. Witness Gibbon or Robertson. Or of the benefits of ancient institutions like Saxon democracy, destroyed by the, quote, Norman yoke, end quote, rather than racial differences per se. By the mid-century, however, a biologically rather than an environmentally centered racial discourse became increasingly popular. A variety of sciences, primarily anthropology and philology, and pseudosciences like phrenology, which attempted to correlate skull types to personality, and anthropometry, the measurement of skull size, combined to fix a far more ontological and determinist notion of racial hierarchy. Where am I? And specifically of Saxons, Teutonic, or Caucasian superiority, upon debates about comparative political institutions and cultural and economic performance. The language of race, omnipresent at least tacitly in the discourse of civilization, generally now not only hardened considerably as a result, the imputed distance between the, quote, higher and the, quote, lower races widened perceptibly, and a dismissive contempt for the, quote, lower races grew markedly. Thus Robert Knox's The Races of Men, published in 1850, notoriously claimed that, quote, in human history, race is everything, end quote, and asserted that a blue-eyed Saxon race was poised to dominate the world. Those anxious to wrap themselves in the mantle of classical antiquity, like the founder of comparative politics, Edward Freeman, laid stress upon the racial continuity of Hellenic, Teutonic, and Anglo-Saxon stock. As in the United States, where ideas of, quote, manifest destiny, based on racial Anglo-Saxonism provided a rationale for imperialism. Late 19th century European racialism emerged during the scramble for empire and united, as it were, to new notions of nationalism, helped to displace class conflict onto a imperial context. In Britain, Victorian pride now degenerated into insufferable arrogance. Effort and virtue had not painted the map pink. A natural racial order had instead triumphed. The Carlylean hero, who had been defined not by racial type but fortitude of character, is now a great Anglo-Saxon rather than a great man. This is not Kipling's mental world, where the, quote, white man's burden, end quote, is the duty of Anglo-Saxons to civilize the backward races. Instead, by the 1870s, it was unexceptional for writers like the radical Charles Dilke to proclaim triumphantly that the racial destiny of, quote, Saxondom, end quote, entailed displacing the, quote, cheaper, end quote, races through colonization. Thus, in the last decade of the century, as concerns over the degeneration of the species became more prevalent, it was widely assumed that, quote, inferior, end quote, races would fall victim to the onward march of progress. Darwin himself wrote in 1881 that, quote, at no very distant date, what an endless number of lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races of the world, end quote. H.G. Wells similarly warned that if the non-white races failed to, quote, develop sane, vigorous, and distinctive personalities for the great world of the future, it is their portion to die out and disappear, end quote. Hence, eugenicists, like Galton, proposed breeding programs which would result in the disappearance of both, quote, inferior races, end quote, and inferior strata within dominant races. Much of the language of ethnicity which would come to haunt the next century was now in place. The distinctiveness of much of social Darwinism, then, resulted from the popularization of the metaphor of the, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, or of human, quote, fitness, end quote, to the end of a common goal, though this remains a widely accepted definition of the term. Instead, the specificity of social Darwinism lay in the wedding of these two to the four shifts in thought outlined here, and most especially in the mapping of a quasi-ontological racial discourse onto a redefinition of, quote, fitness, end quote, as, quote, intelligence, end quote. And an identification of, quote, intelligence with the, quote, white races. This intellectual shift was not indicated as such by the origin of species or the pre-existing metaphor of struggle which Darwin and Wallace adapted from Malthus in particular. Instead, it was the product of a debate in the 1860s in which Darwin accepted the application of natural selection to humanity by other writers and incorporated it into his own views, with others following suit, crafting a language of exclusion which was internally directed at class antagonism and externally to racial conflict. Therefore, at least until the Second World War, social and political discourse would be obsessively permeated by organic analogies in which the language of, quote, struggle, end quote, and, quote, fitness, end quote, of superior and inferior, quote, types, quote, species, quote, characters, and nations can be encountered at every turn. It is its use in justifying the Holocaust finally debased the language so far as to nearly remove it from common currency, and instead, for the time being, a less threatening and militarist conception of international economic competition predominates, in which, quote, fitness, end quote, is simply economic competitiveness. Impolite references to biological determinism and race have been dropped, and a place seems A place seems promised for all at nature's feast, though for latecomers the queue for spare places still remains as interminably slow as ever Malthus envisioned. Royal Holloway, University of London.